Hello! In this video, I will be responding to Abortion and Ben Shapiro by PhilosophyTube, where I will be saying that there's not an equivalence between Ben Shapiro being linked to the violinist and the link between a fetus and its mother. Hello, I'm Anawultus, and as someone who is familiar with moral dilemmas and who is very confident for his solutions to various permutations of the trolley problem, I'd like to address the particular problem that was brought up on PhilosophyTube concerning the episode Abortion and Ben Shapiro, wherein the hypothetical stand-in for Ben Shapiro was, of course, linked to Violinist acting as essentially the kidneys for that violinist in order for that violinist to survive. And, of course, I have read of this particular moral conundrum previously, so this is not my first exposure to it. However, I am characterizing it through the arguments made in that particular video as a sort of response to the bread tuber PhilosophyTube. So here we go. So I would say that the primary distinction, of course, before we actually get to that, I think the best place to start is the premises that we are going to be using for these arguments. So of course, I'm going to be using similar premises to the ones used in the video, just for consistency's sake, although when we maybe get deeper down to it, there might be actually some differences, but I'll just be consistent with the video on the surface level. So, of course, a premise that we can take is that human life has value, and that the value of various human lives is interchangeable, and that the value of such human lives is important, and therefore to save a life is good, and to end a life is generally bad. Now, of course, there are many caveats that come with that, but that's essentially an important moral framework of the video, and my video as well, in order to explain which particular philosophical directions we're going, even though neither of us might be necessarily the cool kids philosophers. I'd just like to point out those things. So I say that the qualitative difference between the relationship of a mother and her embryo that is developing in the womb, and that of, let's say, two unrelated individuals, one of whom is from a situation that he may not have volunteered, immediately necessary for the survival of the other. So, particularly in the scenario where the violinist had problems with his kidneys, perhaps kidney failure, and therefore his blood is being passed through the other individual's kidneys in order to cleanse the blood, because otherwise he'll die. So the difference I see there is not one that is really explained too deeply in the socialist ethics, and not even that much in liberal ethics for that matter, but rather comes from a more older and traditionalist, some might even say conservative position, and that is that parents have particular responsibilities toward their children which strangers do not have towards each other. And that's the qualitative difference. It's that in a society as we live in, there are particular divisions of labor, which led to, of course, the advancement and development of such societies. However, that's not necessarily the important part here. What's important is that in the society in which we live, there is an emphasis on the importance and the responsibilities that parents have towards their children, and therefore also certain privileges that also come on the flip side. There are costs and there are benefits as well. So it is worth saying that there are essentially the relationship between a parent and a child is a different relationship between someone who might be of parenting age and an individual that is not that person's child. For example, if you have a child that is your child, as a parent, you have a responsibility to shelter the child and to provide for the well-being of that child. But let's say you temporarily decide to provide for the well-being of someone who is not your child. And then at some point you decide to stop providing for the well-being of that individual that is not your child. That individual that is not your child, by virtue of being not your child, is not entitled to the continuance of your support. And therefore, it is not a moral imperative for you to support that individual, because that individual is not your child. However, if you were to adopt that child, then it would be your responsibility, and therefore, if you neglect your child, in particularly in Western cultures, I know that it might not be the same place everywhere, you can get in trouble with the law if you do not actually provide for the well-being of your child. So there's actually a particular responsibility. And if one of the premises that we take is that the fetus is in itself a human life and therefore the child, then what we have to say is that as a human being, the fetus therefore falls under human relationships and responsibilities of those human relationships. And it is for that reason that I make a distinction between Ben Shapiro and the Violinist and the mother and child. And this isn't just a relationship that is familial. It is something that occurs in other parts of society as well. For example, if you see a crime occurring, a violent crime, you may or may not have a responsibility to do something about it. If you are an individual, a passerby, it is not necessarily your responsibility to interfere. However, if you are someone who does have a responsibility, like, for example, you are active duty policeman or perhaps even military in some situations, then you do have a responsibility, because as a policeman you have a responsibility to ensure that there is a peace kept in your community. And to do that, you will have to be proactive in stopping violent crime. Now, of course, there are different strategies that can be taken. It doesn't necessarily mean going right in and up to someone who is immediately taking a violent crime and attacking that individual. It could also be more staking them out, following someone. But none of those things are such things that are required of someone who is not a policeman and someone who therefore does not bear such responsibilities. Similarly, there are medical ethics. A doctor has particular responsibilities to his patients that someone else might not have. Someone who is not a medical professional does not share the same responsibilities. So, and also there are responsibilities that are brought to you by employment. I know that many socialists are not so keen on these as much, but as someone who is employed, you have particular responsibilities to your employer, and if you do not fulfill your obligations, then your employer might be justified in taking particular actions to either incentivize you to fulfill those responsibilities or to excise you from the business for not having fulfilled the responsibilities. Same thing for employers themselves. They have particular responsibilities as well, and particular privileges that go with being employers, and political leaders, and anyone that signs a contract. And you might even say that there are responsibilities in marriages. So ultimately speaking, there are all these different responsibilities. And you might say, well, what if I don't like that society has placed these responsibilities? Because saying that society wants something is not necessarily saying that it is good or that it is necessary or that it is in some ways something that should be. However, then the question becomes, who can place responsibilities? Because ultimately speaking, I don't think that the socialist would go to the degree to say that no one is responsible for no one else. But instead, the socialist leaning is to mobilize all of society and the entirety of the economy for the good of the people or even the workers, depending on the particular rhetoric that is being taken. Now, this can happen in more anarchist ways or in more centralized authoritarian ways. But ultimately speaking, there is an emphasis on collective responsibility. Now, I would say that a communitarian outlook on such responsibilities is indeed counter to the development and the progress of civilization. As I can clearly observe in the writings of Karl Marx, a big problem in various types of socialism is that there's a general opposition to varying forms of division of labor in varying ways. It's not always the same, and not all socialists have particular oppositions to particular types of division of labor. So there's, of course, there's a specialization division where there's different types of professions, and that is opposed to certain agrarian schools of thought. And then there's the division of social hierarchy, which is also very important for the development of civilization, which is opposed in a larger sense by varying types of socialists to a greater degree. And of course, the family and the sexual division of labor is, of course, also opposed by certain socialists as well. So ultimately, that's why I say that socialism is contrary to the growth of civilization. But you may say, well, get back on the idea of ethics. What about the ethics of whether or not these responsibilities are responsibilities that should exist, and whether or not they should be placed upon particular individuals rather than society as a whole? Well, I say that the question then becomes, what is your foundation for ethics? The real epistemology of your ethics. And, of course, if you were to say perhaps the course of nature, then, of course, that already puts into question ideas concerning abortion, so that might not be the best way to go based on your argument. But if instead we were to say the benefit of all humans, then the question is, why should all humans have the benefit? Now, if you grant that humans have value and human lives are important, then that, of course, follows in some sense. However, do human lives have value? And what makes human lives important? And that's when you really get down to it, that basing such things in such loose philosophical terms doesn't actually produce something that logically leads to a consistent moral code. So ultimately, what you end up is going towards a more functional route, that morality and virtue and justice, if they are not defined by nature or by broad ideas concerning value, which are unprovable, then you end up having to go that morality and justice are based upon authority. Now, this is not necessarily governmental authority. This can be authority in a family, can be authority in the business place. It can be authority in many different ways. However, ultimately, what we have is that morality, in a very functional sense, is an artifice of the powerful. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. In fact, I think that's a good thing. But ultimately, what we have from this is that who gets to decide morality is the greater power, the higher power. And to oppose that power is in itself an opposition towards justice and is ultimately fundamentally immoral, since it is unjust or unrighteous to oppose the very thing that establishes justice and righteousness from a functional sense. Let me be very clear on that. So, of course, classically speaking, the top of the hierarchy is considered to be a deity. And, of course, if you were to grant that there does exist someone who knows all, sees all, and judges all, then it would make sense that that authority would be the highest authority, and that in conflicts of morality, that authority is the one that you should bring up. However, let's say, hypothetically speaking, that that does not exist. So what instead you have is that the highest authority is indeed the state. And as a moral authority, the state then gets to decide the morality. Now, this is not to say that a state could not devolve or distribute or decentralize or in other ways reduce its own arbitrative scope. However, it is to say that ultimately what decides whether something is right or wrong is either a deity or the state, or in many cases, for the viewpoints of many individuals, a combination of both, as one would see from the writings of John Jewell in an homily against disobedience and willful rebellion. So what this means, what does this mean for our moral dilemma? What this means is that morality is ultimately partisan, and to place value on human lives is to be in favor of that particular party, not in an organized party sense, but more in a preferential sense, that there are certain preferences that when forming a society you make. Now, these preferences may be either guided by obedience towards the preferences of an already existing higher power, or by your own preferences that might not be in line with that higher power. So ultimately, might makes right. But anyway, tell me what you think. You can follow me on Twitter to get upload notifications. That's generally what I would use Twitter for. If you want to contact me, I suggest you use the comment section. When it concerns videos, I also automatically post onto BitChute as a little bit of insurance, because I know sometimes I can be a little bit of an edgy lad. But anyway, thank you all for watching. Tell me what you thought. If you would like to come on to my show and talk about these things, and anyone is welcome, so long as you can be civil and respectful to the audience. But I'm just generally looking for a lot of feedback. And if you like the video, please do like and subscribe, and if you feel so inclined, share the video, so that if you like something, you might as well send it to others as well. But tell me what you think. So anyway, thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltus. Over and out.